everyone. Hope you're having a great day. He is Paul Gerard. I'm Kevin Kelly with Gerard and Associates. This is the G&A Way podcast, and thank you for tuning in. Check us out at gerardassociates.com, Podbean, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, YouTube. I mean, we got you covered for EMS CQI on social media. Hey, Paul, it's great to be with you as always. How you doing, man?
I'm doing well. How you doing?
I'm doing all right. I've been on this waxing nostalgic tour.
Yeah, I've noticed on social media. I've noticed
social media. Yeah, we're
doing a lot of
that
waxing.
Yeah,
we did. Yeah.
And since the Foxwoods gig,
Right?
and reminiscing about our late night chats when we were sitting on the paramedic 1 unit at St. Luke's Hospital, and between doing our shootings and stabbings, we were always waxing philosophical about EMS systems and how to be the best.
Yeah.
And I remember having a conversation with you, and it was sort of like, is this it? Is this, I was feeling a sense that there was something more out there as far as EMS systems and excellence and how to be the best. What's the secret sauce behind these MAHOPs, paramedic units, these non-transporting ALS units of the 90s, and the qualifications and the swag that you needed to get one of those jobs.
Yeah.
And I was thinking about, do you remember these conversations?
Oh, absolutely. We would sit in the McDonald's parking lot at 2 a.m, and we'd be sleep deprived from running our asses off all day long and couldn't quite get to sleep yet because we had just done something. And we'd sit there and we'd eat cold French fries and talk about the state of affairs of EMS and how we can help make things better. And we did a lot of philosophizing. Is that a word? Philosophizing back then?
It's a G&A word.
Yeah. Okay. So word now. So Webster's going to add that to the dictionary set now that I've said it. So yeah, we did a lot of discussions, and this was one of them. But back then, the title of our podcast is the EMS 1%ers,
right?
In search of excellence, the EMS 1%ers. But back then, Kevin, if you recall, our philosophy was there was a top 5%, not a 1%.
Yeah.
Right? You remember that?
I remember. Yep, the 95. You're right.
Yeah. And then several years later, when we thought things were going downhill in EMS and the world was changing and things were getting worse and all that sort of stuff, we were highly critical of the paramedics coming out of school, and we adopted the 1%. There's no science behind it. We didn't measure anything.
Right.
We're just using our own thought processes, and we called it the 1%. And that kind of stuck over the years. We've always, you and I know what that means, right? We're referencing the best of the best.
The best of the best.
And we routinely use that term, but the rest of the world may or may not recognize it as a term in relation to EMS.
Do you remember the book that you turned me on to back then? You were, I think you were working on your bachelor's degree in business at Bryant, and you were an entrepreneurial kind of guy. I mean, it was about developing systems, developing businesses, customer service, treating. You were very entrepreneurial and systems-wide thinking in your philosophizing about EMS. But you remember the book that you made me get it, but you turned me on to inspire me?
Boy, yeah. See, now you're making me reach way back. But if I'm not mistaken, it was In Search of Excellence by Tom Peters.
In Search of Excellence by Tom Peters.
All right, there we go.
That's it. That was the first formal. If the G&A Way EMS CQI podcast were to start a book club, that's the book we'd probably start with.
Hey, that's a great idea. We should start a book club.
So, do you remember what the book was about?
Yeah, again, you're going back to, this was back in the late 80s and very, very early 90s you're talking.
Yeah.
And, I'm almost 60 years old now, so my memory doesn't work as well as it used to. But it talked about the essential traits of managers. It has nothing to do with EMS. It's just a business management book.
Yeah.
And we used to read a lot of that literature back then.
Yep.
Still do, but to a lesser degree now. But we certainly read a lot of that back then, trying to feel our way through how we should manage EMS systems. And it talked about the top companies and what characteristics and traits they use that made them the top companies.
Yeah.
And a lot of it involved HR development, personnel development and personnel, if I remember correctly.
Yeah, yeah. So it was really a blueprint for how to become top tier. What are all of the elements? What's the secret sauce about becoming top tier of whatever, whether it be a paramedic, whether it be a plumber, whether it be an accountant? How to be the best of the best, how to
Right.
be top gun. And that was a lot of our discussion back then is how do we become more of a key player in the public safety and healthcare arena? What does that look like? How do we shine? How do we become those one percenters?
Right.
These guys, and we held ourselves out, and it was the reason why everybody wanted to become one of these mayhaps paramedics, these non-transporting paramedics, was because of the esteem, the swagger, the prestige, the difficulty in getting that job. And the only better job for a paramedic at the time, in my opinion, would have been that of a flight paramedic.
Right.
With all of the academic credentials, customer service skills that you need to perform at that high level.
Yeah. A lot of those flight
So,
medics work part-time for the hospital-based systems. A
and a
number of them
lot of
worked
them
for us
did.
at Norwood and at St. Luke's, actually.
Yeah, yeah. So, it's so getting back to the podcast is what does excellence in paramedicine look like? What does EMS CQI look like to get us to that top tier level? And why do only a handful of paramedics aspire for that clinical
Yeah.
quality greatness? And why are so many, and this is just my opinion, and this is just our observation over 40 years, combined 80 years in EMS.
Right.
Why are there some that aspire to be flight paramedics, and why are there those that don't? What are these EMS one percenters that we speak of? What does that EMS one percenter behavior look like?
Right.
What are
Right.
your thoughts?
For me, well, first of all, the definition of a one percenter to me is a paramedic's paramedic, right? The person who is well-rounded in all respects, where management respects them, their coworkers respect their clinical acumen, and they represent how EMS should be performed, right? They're the folks. And you and I spent years and years on this and studied all sorts of material trying to figure it out, because after those days sitting in the parking lot at McDonald's, we went on to manage systems, and we had the opportunity to put some of this stuff into effect and to try to hire and or create more one percenters with varying degrees of success. In some cases, we helped people blossom tremendously, and they went on to have great careers. And in other cases, people just didn't take to it. So we've always talked about this. And to me, it comes back to, interestingly enough, it ties back into our 4 C's leadership model theory that we have posted on the website, right?
Mm-hmm.
So the 4 C's are command presence, compassion, competitiveness, and coachability.
Yep. Right.
And to me, a one percenter provider has all 4 of those characteristics. But I would argue, and you might think differently, the most important of those, in my mind, is compassion. It's not a clinical topic. And here's why.
Right. Yeah.
Years and years of management, when we worked at Norwood, you were my assistant director, I was the director, and we grew the service significantly and added a whole transfer division, a billing office, a dispatch center. We added all these elements. We were doing anything that moved within the Ponce Valley health system. We had a motor pool division that worked for us. And a lot of those guys aspired to eventually become EMTs and ultimately paramedics in some cases. And our paramedics today, even though they worked for they were transporting packages and mail and donuts for physician meetings and the like. And we discovered that hiring the best clinicians didn't always work out well for us. So, and we had very highly trained and highly experienced clinicians working for us, because, as you mentioned, the hospital-based systems in Massachusetts back in the 80s and 90s and 2000s attracted the best of it. Those are the jobs to have for the most part.
Right.
But we had a number of providers who were excellent clinicians, but we got more complaints on them than anybody else, and their coworkers hated them. And it really was because their bedside manner and their interpersonal skills sucked.
Right.
So we tasked our hiring committee to revamp the entire hiring process to work around good human beings that give a shit, who also happen to be EMTs and paramedics. It's easier, in my opinion,
Right.
to take a average, mediocre, sometimes even a poor paramedic or EMT who's a good human being and train them up on their clinical stuff.
Coach them
That's
up.
easier. Coach them up. That's easier than hiring somebody who's technically very proficient but has no compassion for the patient. So long-winded answer, but that's kind of my general thought on it. What's your opinion? What in your mind? What's a 1%er?
Well, I would suggest that it would be a person or a paramedic that models the behaviors of you and I. And no, I don't.
So
I
those
know
guys
that
are
sounds, braggadocio, but
right.
but you know what I mean.
Well,
Like
it is.
it is, but we gave a crap about more than just the patch. We wanted to see the ball in the profession move in an upward direction.
Yeah.
And you got to walk the talk to be able to do that.
Right.
Yeah, compassion. You're absolutely right. Compassion, you got to have it. It's you got to recognize it's progress, not perfection.
Right.
There's empathetic listening. I mean, you
Right.
got to care more about the totality of the patient care than just your ability to stop the line and drop the tube.
Yeah.
And we forget about that.
Right.
98% of this thing is all bedside manner.
Yeah, that's right. That's right.
So, I think that there isn't one. I think it's the totality of those 4 C's that come together in the right package, that if the paramedic can sell that to the patient, to their CQI coordinator, to the chief, and communicate at that high level. Remember, I mean, back then it was all you had to know about the Krebs cycle and the blood gas equation, the acid base equation, right?
Right.
That
Right.
was
Yeah,
the big, that was the barometer back then on how
you could spout off all the
academically,
elements.
yeah, your intelligentsia was. It was your ability to regurgitate the Krebs cycle and know how many ATPs came off of it at what stage. And then the manipulation of the acid base equation. If you could answer questions, you would pose those questions, you and your colleagues back then. And if we could answer those questions, we were like, oh, wow, these guys are really kind of into it. And then, of course, we'd have to go out and we'd have to demonstrate that we could intubate. That was another. You had to be able to use a laryngoscope. Don't have to today because the patients tend to be able to intubate themselves with all the new gadgets on the market.
Right.
But back in our day, you had to use a piece of metal to manipulate the epiglottis to put a plastic tube through 2 weight strands that are a couple centimeters apart, and you had to do so hanging upside down in a car. And the patient had to be conscious. So if you couldn't do that and regurgitate the Krebs cycle and understand the acid base equation, you flunked out of Mayhop school.
Right.
Now it's entirely different. But now it is much more of a focus, not so much on the ability to drop that tube, but on the ability to drop that tube. And even if you get it wrong, make it so the family, the regulatory agency, the CQI coordinator says, you know what, you really did a great job. A couple of holes in the Swiss cheese that we got to fill. But, you're eager, you're coachable, you're compassionate, you got this command presence, your competitiveness, you care.
Right.
And so my long-winded answer is the totality of all of what I just said, that is us, that's Kevin and Paul, but it's also that Mayhop's personality, and it's that flight paramedic personality that, you know what, bring on the CQI.
Well, let me ask you this.
Show me. Yeah, go ahead.
Let me ask you this, because you and I go off script all the time, right? We have a very loose, vague script, and we kind of ad lib a lot. So I'm going to ad lib something
telegraphing?
here.
You're telegraphing that I'm off script?
Yeah, right. Yeah, it's my polite way to say, shut up. Shut up and get back to that. No, that's not
nice
true.
job.
So here's a question for you. This is something we've never really discussed directly in the past, but it occurred to me as you were droning on and on with your answer. Does the system make the 1%er, or does the 1%er make the system?
I think I'm going to weasel out of this one. I'm going to use
a lawyer. That's your job.
Right,
You're a lawyer,
right.
so
that's right. So I'm going to weasel out of this. So no. Well, that's a good one. But what's the other weasel lawyer answer? It depends. There
Right.
you go. So that's it, man. And that's that. You're right, because how many aspiring one percenters come into these mediocre leadership
Right.
situations
Well, yep.
and say, you know what, I gave a crap, but you know, I was into the computer and I was learning all kinds of Krebs cycle stuff, but you know, maybe watching Judge Judy in that recliner and not pursuing, you know, the
Yeah.
higher academia, maybe
Yeah.
that's the way to go.
Yeah. Yeah.
So it's a lawyer weasel answer, Paul, but I
Yeah.
think it's a pretty damn good one.
Well, I agree with you because it does depend, right? So you can get a great paramedic who gets destroyed by his service, and you can have a great provider who makes the service what it is, right? So they hire the best of the best. They have a very forward looking outlook and that sort of thing. So, I think you're right. I think that is the proper answer. But it raises the kind of the question: if you want to be the best of the best EMS agency, and you need to have the best of the best provider, but there's only 1% of EMS providers who meet that criteria, we're in the middle of staffing shortages and people leaving the industry at unprecedented rates. How do you run a superior service with superior providers when there seems to be a lack of them? Or is there a lack of them? Is this just you and me blowing smoke out of our asses? And the reality is that 99% of the providers are excellent, and only 1% are less than excellent.
Well, first of all, we can't blow smoke out of our asses because that really foils the marketing plan. So we really have to know what we're talking about, and I believe that we do. And I believe that these 80 years, and even look at some of these paramedic scientists and what they're doing in the Fire Service Psychological Association. It is an amalgam of we are creating. It's an amalgam of expectation reality mismatches,
Right.
and silos and groupthink, and everybody's brand is the best brand. And we think our
Right.
brand's the best brand, right? And then you
Yep.
got guys like that Tim Nowak, that CQI guy on LinkedIn, and Kavanaugh, all these great guys that espouse some really great ideas,
Yeah.
but they all think that their brand is the brand to follow.
Yeah, we all do. Yeah,
Um,
sure.
and I think there's value in all of that diversity of
Right.
thought.
Right.
So how do you do it? I say how you fix EMS is that you sign up with Gerard and Associates and you listen to these G&A Way EMS CQI podcasts,
Yeah.
because
Yeah.
you're going to get something out of this
Right.
that is going to plug a hole in the Swiss cheese during your CQI mentee interaction, that's going to make that mentee better instead
Yeah.
of worse.
Yeah. We don't talk
So
typical CQI talk
no, we
with this
don't.
podcast.
CQI, typical CQI. I don't want to get on a rant, but you got me going on this. Typical CQI thought processes are: it's punitive, it's Gestapo, it's gotcha, it's CYA, all of that.
Find their
We
errors.
don't do that.
Find the error.
Right. Find the errors, because if you find the errors, you justify your job of what? Finding frickin' errors.
Yeah.
So it's easy to find errors. I mean,
Right.
to err is human.
Yeah.
I think they actually called a study "To Err is Human"
Yeah.
about healthcare and the errors in healthcare.
Right. Right.
So that's not the big
Should be.
ticket.
And what the answer to that is, so that people aren't left wondering, is that it shouldn't be about finding errors. It should be about finding opportunities for improvement, which means every single call is an opportunity for improvement.
To improve.
Every
That's
single call is an opportunity for improvement.
Yeah.
But you can't beat up providers with that level of depth unless you have a process that doesn't, hammer them, right? That doesn't give them. It's more collaborative, and that's the way in which we do CQI. But I remember you remember Dr. Geller, right, at Norwood Hospital, our EMS
I
medical
do.
director?
Yes.
Yeah. So when I started, go ahead.
Nah, go ahead.
All right. So anyway, he was our medical director. In 1993, Norwood hired me to be the director and CEO of the EMS division. And so I started, and I was on the job probably for 4, 5, maybe 6 months. I still didn't know where the men's room was yet. I was so new. And a friend of mine from a private ambulance company called up and said, "Hey, I don't know if you've heard, but your board of directors at the hospitals talking about privatizing the EMS division and getting rid of you." And I was in a panic. I just started this with the service, and now they're talking about getting rid of it. And I went to Dr. Geller for advice, and I said, they can't get rid of us. We provide exemplary patient care. They're not going to get this from anybody else. And I used all those emotional arguments. And my own EMS medical director said, yeah, but you can't prove that. There's no objective data, right?
Yeah.
One disco patch from the National Association, right, with all the glitter
Right.
sparkle stuff, is the same on one provider as it is on another. How do you prove that your agency is better, or your providers are better at taking care of patients
Right.
than agency B next door? And that was one of the genesis. That was 1993. That was one of the original thoughts that made me think we have to have a measurement tool where we can compare objectively provider to provider, not only in terms of their clinical care, but to understand what traits that provider has, so that we can have our hiring committee find those people and hire them. And that was kind of the one of the preeminent. Now, it's really disheartening when your medical director says you can't prove you're better than anybody else. And it wasn't because he didn't believe in us. He was a solid, hospital-based medical director guy and felt it himself, but we couldn't prove it. And that's
right.
That's a monumental task, trying to prove that.
Yeah, but now it's relatively easy, right? I mean, you got all this NEMSIS data, you got EPCRs, you got all these geniuses out there touting data collection and big data and selling data and analyzing data. And so why would it be so difficult, to prove that, and back then we had to do it on pieces of paper, but I mean, there were other EMS agencies that could not intubate patients, and we would have to, when they brought the codes in, we would be, not even the anesthesiology, we would go in there and intubate the patient in that emergency room.
On the floors too. We were part of the
on the floors too. We were called on the floors. We got difficult IVs, all of that. And I'm not saying that today's people don't do that. I'm sure they do. But why? What drives that ability to want to be the best of the best? And what does the behavior of the mediocre? We say the 1%ers. That means we're talking about the top gun. Well, 99% are not the top gun, but they're somewhere between being a couch potato on the recliner watching the big screen TV and being an aspiring 1%er.
Right.
So there's a continuum of behavior that at each step, at each phase of that behavior, somebody has the opportunity to teach, coach, and mentor positively to get that person more toward the 1%er and away from the recliners and the big screen TVs. And that is why it's not just about the data. It's unbiased data. It's not what you do with the data, but it's how you present the data. And with the G&A way, it's about taking a look. Each piece of paperwork is analogous to a baseball swing.
Mm-hmm.
And every single swing in a baseball player's at-bat appearance is carefully scrutinized. Is your elbow? Well, we've talked about this on other podcasts.
Yeah.
But that's the difference. And it's not what you do, it's how you do it. And we take the approach, and thinking drives behavior. Remember that. # thinking drives behavior. We take the approach that if you do unbiased data collection and present that in a swing coach, we are here to plug holes in the Swiss cheese. So your at bat is the best. Your next at bat is the best at bat.
What you're trying to do is you're trying to shift that bell curve, right? The G&A bell curve. You're trying to shift that. And again, this is that 1% discussion went on and morphed over the years.
Right.
And it turned into more of a bell curve thinking, where you've got the 1%ers on one end, the 1%, although we've modified it, right? That 5% and 5%. So we look at the, top tier providers as being the top 5%, the lowest tier being the lowest 5%, and then the 90% in the middle is in a moldable form. You have the opportunity as a CQI person to create more 1%ers if you can shift the dynamic that folks are not just going out there and accepting mediocrity, but they want to willingly improve themselves through the efforts of the CQI process and get better. Then you're shifting that bell curve to create more 1%ers. So, which is what we do at GNA, but every agency is in some form trying to attempt to do that. I think the problem is that they look at all these disparate potential solutions, and a lot of them involve technology. Oh, I'll just buy a new EPCR program that is better at collecting data, or a new monitor because the monitor now can intubate the patient for us, or whatever. They're looking for the latest, greatest, next toy or tool, thinking it'll help improve behavior. But what causes, and we've said this before, again, it's worth repeating, what gets people to do behaviors that you want them to do is your ability to coach them and convince them and work with them to understand and realize that the approach that you're asking them to take is a better clinical approach on behalf of the patient. If you can't do that, it doesn't matter whether you have AI flag and run reviews for you, or intubation tools that can halfway intubate the patient for you. None of that stuff matters if you can't get the provider at the point of patient contact to think how you want them to think.
Yeah, I think that is spot on. So now let me throw this one out there. Now,
Yep.
you're a swing coach. You're the swing coach of swing coaches, right? I mean, you teach all the swing coaches. Would that be correct?
Through our all collective efforts. It's not just me. I got a great
No, I know,
staff,
but you
and
are the Dalai Lama of all of this swing coach stuff. I mean,
Yeah.
right? So
Okay.
let's suppose that you're out there swing coaching, and you're doing your swing coach gig at Acme Ambulance. All right.
Great.
And on your docket are 5 coach ups. Or I don't know what they are. Maybe they're coaching up, maybe they're other aspects, but you got 5 people that you got to see.
Yeah.
2 of those paramedics, I'm going to say, are like you and I and the flight medics. They're 1%ers. Let's say one of those paramedics, he's an aspiring 1%er, but he really likes the mojo of the guys that sit around on the couch, watch Judge Judy, but can, answer a question or two about the acid-base equation.
Mm-hmm.
And then let's suppose the remaining 2, just after constant bending over backwards, the GNA way, 4 C's coach up sessions, pretty please with sugar on top, just have to be coached out. So 5 paramedics, 2 are 1%ers, one's an aspiring, and 2 just after all reasonable debate and diligence aren't going to cut the mustard.
Right.
What is your day like? Walk me through what your day is like and your psychology is like, and what your expectations versus reality is like with these 5 aspiring paramedics.
Yeah. Okay. That's an interesting question. We actually can predict our own success or failure based on an accurate prediction of provider type. And those categories you just described, you 2 of the so-called 1%ers, that's your easy work, right? Because
so what are these guys like, Paul?
These guys are inquisitive. These guys want to, they're hell-bent on learning everything they can learn, with the thought that it may help them someday on a patient care encounter. So those are easy sells. Those guys, when you come and talk to them. Now, let's divide those 2, because within those 2, there's another subgrouping of provider, and this will determine how my day is going to go in relating to these folks. One of those 2 1%ers is hell-bent on improving himself and cares.
Mm-hmm.
The other so-called 1%er is an imposter 1%er. They may be technically proficient, and everybody respects their clinical ability, but they're not a true 1%er because they're missing a critical element, and that critical element is the humanistic approach to providing good patient care, good bedside manner, good partner, co-worker, bystander, interactor, right? That person can take an unruly bystander scene, and through their ability to communicate, they can either improve the situation or they can worsen the situation. But EMS sometimes confuses those 2 1%ers because one is an imposter 1%er. They're not really, because they don't espouse the compassionate stuff. So when you go and you do your CQI process with those folks, the one person of that group who truly aspires is usually an enjoyable discussion because they take the critique pretty well, even if they don't agree with it. They don't have to agree
Yeah.
with it. We actually get into some pretty good rip-roaring debates on these calls. But when there's a level of respect and trust between the CQI guy and the provider, you can have those intense discussions without anybody's feelings getting hurt or anybody walking away offended. And they turn out to be, I constantly have people say, oh, I love debating this shit with you. And we
Yeah.
have a good time, even though we disagree fundamentally on certain principles of EMS and how they should go down. The conversations are always engaging. They're always educational. They're always informative. And it helps me to understand that provider better and how I should communicate with them. The imposter paramedic, the 1% imposter, that's a difficult because that person usually is technically proficient. They do pretty well. They get a lot of pats on the back for getting that tough tube and, identifying that sepsis when other people would have missed it and all these types of things. And because they're not coachable and they're not approachable, and they sometimes don't have a proper degree of empathy for the patient or compassion for their coworkers,
Okay.
that person's got the kind of the know-it-all-y kind of thing. And that's a more difficult provider to deal with. So that one's a little more stressful and a little bit more difficult because you're not going to have a completely helpful conversation because that person may not want to be helped. So that's tough. The in-between guy or gal, right, man or woman, whatever, the in-between person needs help. They're not necessarily clinically as proficient as the 1%er.
Mm-hmm.
But you can coach them up, right? It takes some effort. Right. You're going to kind of build them up over time. You have to create in them certain basic swing patterns that they need to adhere to, and you have to slowly build that person up over time. But again, those conversations are not usually terribly difficult because there is some degree of I'll work with you on some level, and you just got to figure out what that level is so that you can exploit it, right? So you can figure out what triggers them, what makes them respond to stuff, and what makes them act. The two on the bottom end that you've coached up for months or years and is still not getting it, those are always the clear-cut most difficult. Those are usually also in that know-it-all category. They will go down with the ship. In other words, they will continue to do what they want to do in spite of CQI process help, in spite of their medical director saying, shape up or you're out of here, in spite of management reprimanding them, and in spite of OEMS putting them on probation multiple times in some cases. They still will poo-poo the whole improvement thing and say, this is useless. I know better. I can handle this. And so those are the most difficult folks to have conversation. At least the 1%er who's an imposter, they're proficient enough and you can still intellectualize with them some of this stuff and win them over with a good intellectual discussion. The bottom 1%ers, the folks who go down with the ship over bad patient care without wanting to improve themselves or making any attempt to improve themselves. Those are they come up with all sorts of wacky rationale. I've got, providers who they mistreat a diabetic and you say, hey, guy had a blood sugar of 500. You should have put a line and given him a saline bolus. And they'll say, nah, it's not necessary. He was fine. Vitals were stable. He was conscious enough. I'm a diabetic. I go to 500 all the time and it doesn't bother me. So I'm not going to do what protocol and training and the medical director dictates and wants them to do because they know better. So those are a bit of a bitch. When I do those folks, I'm mentally exhausted at the end of the day. At the end of the day, I'm wiped because the amount of intensity I have to put into the discussion to try to keep the conversation positive and on the rails is very difficult. And it can go off the rails pretty easily with some of those folks. So that could be a long day. It depends on how much time I have to spend with each of those providers, which will determine whether I have a good or a bad day in terms of, getting done and feeling like I've accomplished something positive for the patient and for the provider and trying to get them to do things that, in CQI, you should be about, and we are about protecting the provider. We're not there to show that they're bad providers. We're trying to protect them and help them to stay out of trouble.
Yeah.
And that's a tough job when the person doesn't want to help themselves.
Yeah, I mean, these two, the bend over backwards guys, I mean, they're knuckleheads. They're morons. Right, they don't get it. They're the guys that will want to sink and intentionally sink the ship because they can't be the freaking captain.
Right.
That's it. All right. There's a couple of key points here. You got to make sure it's about patient care and not personalities, right?
Right.
So when you're
Right.
decision making that these guys have bent over backwards and we've coached them up, it's time to coach them out. Let's make sure that's not solely based on we just don't like their
Right.
mojo.
Right.
They truly suck and are hurting
Yeah.
people.
Yeah. There really
And
are very few of those who are on that I'll go down with the ship boat.
yeah,
So, but the problem I think is EMS CQI coordinators get frustrated with people because they're not doing what they
yeah,
want, and they start to lump them into that boat prematurely without giving them the full, proper process of trying to convince them and cajole them and get them to come over from the dark side to the light side. So they
yeah.
prematurely go to well, this must be a discipline thing because we can't convince them otherwise, and they go down that road way too soon in my mind.
Yep, yep. And this is a key point. You still got to document the crap out of it. You still got to make sure that you sit and you don't treat them any different than anybody else. And you put up with that crap and you document it, and it becomes a management leadership problem. You've coached them up, you boxed them in. They don't care about the patient. They don't care about the risks associated with being a paramedic, and it's time to separate those folks from the organization and get them out of EMS because they need to be doing something else. Just a quick thought. So the teaching, coaching, and mentoring sessions, the 2 paramedics, 1%ers, one's an imposter 1%er. I thought an imposter 1%er, and this is why, and maybe it's a little different because I work for you, so you can tell me where I'm not an imposter, but I always thought, and I always conducted myself, that I had a hell of a lot more experience in all phases of the game than I actually did. I started on a civil service fire department where there were 4 paramedics, 1 per group.
Right.
Who the fuck was teaching, coaching, and mentoring me? This was OJT while you're building the paramedic ALS unit airplane while it's flying. Right. That's what it was back then. There weren't a lot of teacher coaches. There were only 3 or 4 paramedic programs. Only 600 of us.
Right.
That's changed, but. I always thought that I had to puff up and be smarter because what a deputy fire chief told me, what you lack in experience, you got to make up for in education. So in order to compete with you and get that job and have Paul Gerard like me, I had to talk like Paul Gerard. And then I had to, when I was put in those positions where I had to intubate upside down in a car, I couldn't sit there and say, hey, Paul, I'm really an imposter. Can you do this for me? I had to do it. Yeah. And you want to know something? When I did it, I got it right. And every time thereafter. But I always thought going into those great jobs that I was not worthy of any of that because I had no experience. Yeah. So I had to puff myself up and act like I had all of this experience that I didn't have back then. And I got the job. And then once I got the job, I got the great teaching, coaching, and mentoring that I didn't get because it just wasn't there. I was king of the world, man. I was working in Mayhops. I was working for St. Luke's Hospital. Not that, there weren't issues and opportunities and other things, but I mean, that's what I aspired to be. And I left a great job because I wanted to be the best paramedic that I could be. I thought it was at another larger fire department, but it ended up being at St. Luke's. And then from there, that catapulted me into becoming the assistant director at Norwood under your command. And then from there, I got the Webster gig. But I have to admit that, I wasn't an imposter on the customer service. Right. I mean, nobody could ever, and I wasn't an imposter on actually the skills, but I felt like an imposter. I could do the gig. I just didn't have the reps.
Yeah, we all do, right? We're going to actually do another session next season because we're wrapping up this season, our first season. We're going to do one of our top 3 discussions is going to be on imposter syndrome. We've all felt what you felt at some point. Yeah. And it impacts our abilities. And again, as a CQI officer, you need to understand the psyche of the provider in order to help them and understand when that person is going through an episode of imposter syndrome and what to do about it. So we're going to do that in a future future podcasts. But I wanted to get back to the one percenters. Is one of a great quote that I heard from an old friend of ours, Tom Pimentel, right back in our St. Luke days. So this is a quote going back to the late '80s. He and I one day were sitting in quarters and we were just bullshitting and talking. And I brought the topic of the one percenters came up, and I said, Tom, what's different about a hospital-based medic and maybe you and I and other folks that we respect for their abilities? What's the difference between them and what seems to be kind of the masses, a lot of the mediocrity out there? And he spontaneously said, the difference between you and I and other providers is that you and I are reading JAMA, GEMS, New England Medical Association stuff, Lancet, and our peers are reading Mad Magazine. And for those folks who are listening who don't know, Mad Magazine is a cartoon magazine with Alfred P. Newman, the front cover with the goofy big ears, goofy hair, freckles all over her, and a tooth gap. And it was a satirical magazine, so people were gravitating towards the Judge Judy's and that in their downtime. And in our downtime, we were reading medical journals. So I think that really summarizes what a one percenter is to a large degree. That doesn't include the personal component, right? That's just the clinical desire, the competitiveness part of the 4 C's, us wanting to be competitive and outdo each other in terms of our clinical acumen, our skill levels and whatnot. We didn't want to be the low man on that totem pole and be known to, because those are small services, right? There were only 6 or 8 full-timers and a handful of per diems.
That's right.
For a single truck that was a regional EMS truck, or ALS truck. So they were hard jobs to get. And then once you got them, there was all sorts of scrutiny on you. Back in those days, our medical director, if you screwed up a call, the medical director would call you in, give you a little bit of shit about it, and then tell you that at the next M&M round, you're presenting this topic to your peers.
Yeah. Yep. Oh, that's right.
M&M Remember
rounds.
How stressful that was?
Yeah.
Because we were all, we would eat our young, right? We were so competitive, maybe too competitive in some cases, but we were so competitive that the thought that I'm going to have to admit my failure on a call and I'm giving this topic because I failed, and my medical director was forcing me to go find answers on my own so that I could teach them to folks who were as smart, if not smarter than I was. That's incredibly intimidating.
Yeah.
So, and then he would sit there at rounds, you would give your presentation. These guys, because we were all competitive, our peer coworkers would bust our balls mercilessly. Yes. Hey, we probably have to cut that, bleep that, right? Bust our balls.
What?
Chip. All right. Chip.
No, balls is fine.
Our behind the scenes engineer and producer. So Chip, you're going to have to tweet that out later. But anyway, you get the point.
You make Christmas balls. So it's holiday season.
Christmas
we know
balls.
What you
there we go. Busted our Christmas balls. So
there you go. Nice.
So it was incredibly intimidating, but it forced us to become better and to know the topic well enough that you could now out-talk your peers who probably prior to that incident and that call and that research being done probably could have talked you under the table about that topic. And they felt the same way, right? When they had to present, they wanted to show you that they weren't a dummy lackey who's presenting because they screwed up a call. They're coming from I now know my shit, and I'm going to teach you a thing or two.
Yep.
So
I had to present.
Yeah, we all did. We all did. I did. You did. Yeah. I remember working with, and again, we'll throw in another name, right? Tom Patterson, old-time paramedic, St. Luke,
one of my
great
partners,
guy.
as was Tom Pimentel. I mean, I indebted to those guys for my clinical acumen.
Yeah, he had to do a topic on CHF, I believe it was, one day. And he and I were working together before the M&M rounds where he had to present this. And he said, my memory's a little vague on this. I believe he said to something similar to, do you know the 16 causes of CHF? And I went, the 16 causes of CHF? And he went, yep. And I knew right there that he had done his homework and that he was going to be presenting shit that I didn't know at this conference. And then after that, interestingly, after he did the presentation, he did his thing for weeks after, he would constantly be quizzing the rest of us on the 16 causes of CHF. And we would try to recite for him, what we learned from his topic.
Do you remember the sarcastic answers that we would give? It would be the 16 causes of CHF are potato chips, popcorn,
That's
bacon,
right, right,
Easter
right.
ham.
Yeah,
We were
right,
down
right.
in New Bedford, so it was the
Yeah,
Portuguese sausage.
Portuguese
Those were
sausage.
the.
Yeah,
Remember that? We were.
chorizo. Yeah, I
That's
do.
what we
Yeah, yeah,
did.
yeah, yeah.
So
It
that's
was fun, but it was
it
also
was fun.
stressful.
It
Yeah,
was stressful, and I remember having to do it, and I had imposter syndrome doing it. But fortunately, I think mine was a guy criked himself. He actually slit his own throat right above the larynx. It was just surgically perfect, but he was conscious, breathing. The trachea was flopping around. So we grabbed the trachea, cedar-cane the cords, grabbed an ET tube, clipped it through the adapter on the ET tube, slipped it through, cedar-cane the cords, slipped it through, secured it all, and that's how we managed the airway. So it was a real dramatic call, and it went
right,
really well. And the guy
right,
lived, and it was
right.
like, "Hey, how did you do that?" Well, it was really simple if you think it through. You just got to cedar-cane the cords. And once we cedar-cane the cords, he was fine.
That
But
sounds easy, but in real life, your sphincter was
it's
probably
not.
as tight as it gets on the
Oh,
actual
good
call
Lord Almighty!
itself.
You
You
know the
must have been
worst
sweating it.
the worst part of the calls were never on the call. It was wheeling the patient in while everybody was standing there
Right, right.
waiting for the patient after you called in all this dramatic ALS
Yeah,
stuff.
yeah, yeah, yeah.
Remember back in the day, you couldn't get away with, "Hey, we're on the way, it's a STEMI."
Right, right.
You had to be detailed. They wrote everything down. You had a
Yeah,
pad. You
yeah.
had to check off all the box. They would listen to your radio reports and critique you on how you
Right,
called reports in. It
right.
was it was a whole different environment. But you bring up a really good point between folks to the 99% and the one percenters, and how much of these one percenters actually go through an M&M round style like group critique, like physicians do, and
Right.
and all of that. So
Well,
back then, we were
yeah,
doing that kind of
yeah,
stuff.
yeah, yeah.
Today, you can't do it because people cry and you're picking on
Exactly.
them,
It's
and
a
then you're
kinder,
coloring
gentler.
books and
Yeah,
crayons and all of this
yeah,
stuff.
yeah, yeah.
So
It's
it's a lot
definitely
different.
right.
The incubation system, the incubator, is a lot different today than it was back then. Even though back then, you probably shouldn't have been doing the things and
Yeah,
embarrassing people, and
yeah,
that just creates PTSD.
yeah,
So
yeah,
not right, wrong, or indifferent,
yeah,
but I wonder if that old M&M style of doing M&M rounds and that style of risk management in QA
yeah.
has some aspect on why one percenters are one percenters.
Well, that's probably why 100% of the one percenters need therapy, and probably
That could be, yeah,
because
yeah.
I think it did a very good job, but it took a stressful job and made it more stressful in a lot of cases.
That's
So,
true.
so I
Yeah.
think for today's EMS to kind of circle back to the one percenters and the CQI part, and to kind of wrap things up a little, I think that today's providers, we need, I don't know if it's 1% are the best of the best. Maybe it's 5%, maybe it's 10%, maybe it's 50%. I don't know. But I do know that in day-to-day EMS systems all over the country, providers need more help getting to a higher level of ability. And our CQI folks are the ones who can do it. I mean, the whole management team needs to be of a thought process that we need to work with our providers to help them get better and provide those resources to help them get better. And there is no better resource that you can give them than a good CQI process that gives them good feedback and allows them to have good, healthy discussions on all the what if scenarios of a given call. That takes time, it's labor intensive, that all costs money, but it reaps benefits in terms of the overall clinical care for that provider provides. And remember, one bad provider can wreck your whole service. One good provider can improve tremendously the service culture. So if you can get several of your top dogs in your system to buy into an education-based CQI process that helps, and have them pushing that to the folks that they inspire, then you create a ripple effect. At Norwood, we
Yeah.
called it, we had our A team and we had our B team. The A team was our frontline managers who were working their asses off trying to change the culture, which we didn't just grow the service. We had to change the entire culture of the operation, which is very difficult and
That's
stressful.
right.
But we had our B team, which was the support network for our top guys who would assist them and help them out in their endeavors.
Mhm.
So we were cultivating an A team, we were cultivating a B team, and our expectation was that the A and the B teams would roll it forward by cultivating what the folks that they were most in contact with and had the most influence over. And that's really what it took to change it doesn't change because management says we're going to change the culture and you guys are going to care more, right? That, we're going to be a loving, caring EMS agency. You can make all those edicts you want, but it's winning over the hearts and minds of the street level folks. And the only way to do that is to work with them collaboratively to help them discover their inner greatness. Because within every EMS provider, there's an inner greatness. What's that, Chip, on the back end? Okay. So Chip tells us we're coming up on 50 minutes, that we should probably try to wrap this up so we don't start droning on and on. So final thoughts, Kevin?
So final thoughts. Final thoughts of this, Paul. Thinking drives behavior. The most important role in an EMS organization that we believe is the role of the CQI coordinator, or whatever you want to title that person. And the most important interaction is the interaction between the CQI coordinator and the paramedic.
Yeah.
And it's at that interaction that's a fork in the road.
Right.
And you can go down one fork and that CQI coordinator can help cultivate the 1%er.
Yeah.
You can take the middle of the road and your CQI coordinator can help cultivate that tip of the G&A way, EMS excellence bell curve, that 66% bell curve. You can cultivate and incubate that way. Or, you cannot give a crap at all, be antagonistic, and you can cultivate the couch potatoes who care about the big screen TVs.
Yeah.
And to just wrap it all up, it's all about the 4 C's.
Mm-hmm.
It's all about being inspiring competitiveness, inspiring coachability, right? Inspiring compassion and empathetic listening. It's all about the 4 C's.
Right.
It's modeling that behavior. It's being competitive and compassionate, but most importantly, have that command presence, walk the talk, be a leader, model high performance behaviors that achieve the high performance CQI results that you want, which is protecting your patients and protecting your paramedics.
Right.
That's what I got as a final thought, Paul.
Yeah. I love all that. I agree with it all. I'm going to throw in one more thing. We didn't get a chance to talk too much about this because we're running up against the clock. But if you want a quality organization that cares about patient care as its primary mission, it all starts with the hiring process. You've got to hire folks who have that belief system. If you have folks who think, I want to take great care of patients, and then I want to, sit in the Barco Lounger and watch, Judge Judy or Jerry Springer, that's not your person. So in the interview process, try to understand not just how clinically savvy they are, but try to understand what the makeup of this person is in terms of what they think their job really is. Is it about people? Is it about taking good care of people? What do they read in their downtime? Ask them those types of questions. It sounds like they're throwaway questions, they're bullshit interview questions, but it's actually pretty important. What do you read in your downtime? Well, I read, EMS 1. Okay, that's great. But if the person says here they're reading JAMA and Lancet, and then you say to them, what's the best agency you worked for and what makes that agency great? They're going to give you insight into the type of agency they're looking for. Because if you can't have a 1% agency if you have 100% 99%ers, right? So that was awfully complicated. Those big twists, but you get what I'm saying, right? You got to, and it starts with the hiring process. We have to identify that stuff. Here's a tip. Go download our 4 C's from our website. And the next time you do an interview, have your interviewee read it. It's a short document. Have them read it and have them explain to you what they think the 4 C's represents. Ask them to prioritize the 4 C's in their mind, what's most important to them. And if they say compassion, take an extra look at that person. Don't think that's the least important thing, that you're looking for the command presence and all the other stuff. Use that as part of your process, and you'll be surprised at how much easier your job's going to get and how much better your service is going to get if you can find the right people who fit into your culture, and then you give them the resources and the feedback they need on a regular basis to excel. So that's my final topic. Final thoughts on the topic.
I know we got to wrap this up, but I want to get
Right.
this one thought in.
Okay.
And that is, if you're a CQI coach and that's what you aspire to be, and that's a huge role, right? I mean, the role that is a huge role. If you're a CQI coach and you are sitting before the one percenters who are talking about the Lancet, JAMA, Annals of Emergency Medicine, as a CQI coach, you better understand more than Med Magazine.
Right.
Because that's a command presence thing. You need to be able to walk the talk. If you want to hang with the one percenters,
right,
you better be reading JAMA, or at least more JAMA than Med.
Right.
Is that a good way to wrap it up, Paul?
Absolutely is.
All right. So, well, thank you for listening. We hope you picked up a thing or two on the skill sets and attributes of the EMS one percenter and how you can incorporate those leadership behaviors into your own in search of excellence in EMS. Again, check us out at gerardasoch.com. Follow us on the G&A Way EMS CQI podcast on Facebook, Twitter. I think they call it X now, Paul. LinkedIn social media pages. So for Paul Gerard, I am Kevin Kelly. Stay safe, stay in the fight. Merry Christmas. Happy holidays. Godspeed.
On 5.